Picture a palace so large it holds 9,000 rooms, walls the color of dried blood, roofs of imperial yellow, a single complex at the center of an empire of 400 million people. For almost 5 centuries, no ordinary person could step inside it. It was called the Forbidden City. And behind those walls sat the accumulated wealth of the longest stretch of imperial rule in Chinese history. Gold, jade, porcelain, silk, scrolls, and ceremonial objects gathered across hundreds of years. And then, across a few violent decades, almost all of it left. Some was burned, some was carried across an ocean in wooden crates. Some was loaded onto carts by foreign soldiers and sold in the markets of a captured city. So where did the treasure of the Forbidden City actually go? The answer is not one robbery. It is at least 4, and they did not all happen at once. To understand what was taken, you have to understand what was there. The Qing were the last dynasty to rule China, and they ruled for almost 300 years. The name is pronounced Qing. For that entire span, the Forbidden City was both their home and their vault. Tribute flowed in from every corner of the empire and from the kingdoms that paid to keep the peace. The imperial workshops produced objects of staggering refinement. Porcelain so thin it was nearly transparent, jade carved into shapes that took a single craftsman years to finish. Clocks and automata sent as gifts by European courts hoping to win trade, scrolls of painting and calligraphy that were already 1,000 years old when the dynasty acquired them. This was not simply money, it was the concentrated cultural memory of a civilization locked inside one walled compound in the heart of the capital. Consider what a single object in that collection could be. There was a cabbage carved from a solid piece of jade. The green and white of the stone worked so that the leaves looked alive, with a small insect hidden among them. There was a piece of banded stone carved and colored to look exactly like a slab of cooked pork, fat and lean and crackled skin, a joke in stone that took staggering skill to make. There were bronze vessels older than the dynasty by 2,000 years, kept because they linked the emperors to the very beginning of Chinese civilization. There were imperial seals of carved jade that turned a sheet of paper into law. Any one of these objects could stand alone in a museum and draw crowds. The Forbidden City held them by the tens of thousands, room after room, hall after hall, a density of treasure that no inventory had ever fully captured. But a treasure this size attracts attention, and the 19th century brought enemies the dynasty could not hold off. By the 1800s, the Qing were weakening. The population had outgrown the land. Corruption ate the administration from the inside, and foreign powers, hungry for trade and for silver, began to press on the coast. The flashpoint was a drug. British merchants were selling opium into China by the ton, and when the imperial government tried to stop it, Britain went to war to keep the trade flowing. The wars that followed did not just defeat the Qing, they cracked the empire open and showed the world that the treasure behind the walls could be reached. The first great looting came in 1860, and it did not touch the Forbidden City itself. It fell on a different palace. Outside the capital stood the Yuanmingyuan, the old summer palace, a vast garden complex of pavilions and lakes that many considered even more beautiful than the Forbidden City. The name is pronounced Yuanmingyuan. During the Second Opium War, British and French troops marched on the capital, and when they reached this palace, they looted it room by room. Soldiers filled their packs with whatever they could carry: gold, silk, porcelain, jewelry, ceremonial objects. Officers took pieces that would later hang in European homes and sit in European museums. And then, on the order of the British command, the entire palace was burned to the ground. It took thousands of men several days to destroy it. What they could not steal, they turned to ash. The old summer palace was never rebuilt. Its ruins still stand today as broken stone, a deliberate scar left where one of the wonders of the world used to be. One set of objects from that burned palace tells the whole story of what looting means across time. Around a great fountain in the old summer palace stood 12 bronze heads, each an animal of the Chinese zodiac, designed by a European artist for the emperor. When the soldiers came, these heads were torn from the fountain and carried away. For more than a century, they vanished into private hands scattered across the world. And then, in our own time, they began to reappear at auction, and the sums were enormous. When 2 of the heads came up for sale in Europe, the auction set off a national outcry in China, where the heads are seen not as art, but as stolen national property. Some were eventually bought by wealthy collectors and returned to China as gestures. Others remain missing to this day. A single fountain ornament, looted by a soldier in 1860, became a symbol fought over in courtrooms and auction houses 150 years later. That is how long the trail of a single looted object can run. Therefore, a pattern was set, and the empire learned a terrible lesson. The treasure was not safe simply because it sat behind imperial walls. If the dynasty could not defend the capital, anything inside it could be taken or burned. And the dynasty was running out of strength to defend anything at all. The decades after the burning brought defeat after defeat, indemnity after indemnity. Each lost war meant another payment in silver to a foreign power, draining the treasury even when the objects themselves stayed put. The empire was being bled in 2 ways at once. Its movable treasure was a target, and its actual silver was flowing out by treaty. Then came the second great looting, and this time it reached the heart of the capital. In 1900, a movement rose in northern China against foreign influence, and the violence drew an invasion. An alliance of 8 foreign nations marched on the capital to break the siege of their legations. When they took the city, the looting was systematic. Soldiers from multiple armies stripped temples, palaces, and private homes. The imperial court had already fled, leaving the capital open. Foreign troops moved through the imperial buildings, and objects that had sat untouched for centuries were carried out by the armful. Auctions of looted goods were held openly in the captured city. Diplomats and officers shipped crates home. A great deal of what now sits in foreign collections, labeled politely as acquired in this period, was taken in these weeks when the capital was under occupation and the dynasty had run away. But the most surprising loss did not come from a foreign army at all. It came from the inside, and it came slowly. By the early 1900s, the dynasty was nearly finished. In 1912, the last emperor, a small boy named Puyi, gave up the throne. The name is pronounced Puyi. But under the agreement that ended the dynasty, he was allowed to keep living inside the Forbidden City for more than a decade, a former emperor with no empire, surrounded by treasure he no longer truly ruled. And inside those walls, the treasure began to disappear quietly. Eunuchs and officials, knowing the end had come, smuggled objects out to sell, pieces left through the gates hidden in clothing and carts. At one point, a storehouse of valuables burned down, and many believed the fire was set deliberately to hide how much had already been stolen. The young former emperor himself, aware that his world was ending, began moving objects out of the palace and into the foreign quarter of a nearby city, building a private hoard against an uncertain future. The vault was leaking from within, one hidden object at a time, before the Republic ever took formal control. The method was almost ordinary in its simplicity. The former emperor would select scrolls and small precious objects from the palace collection and hand them out as gifts to his younger brother, who carried them out through the gates without suspicion. day after day, some of the finest paintings and pieces of calligraphy in the entire collection left the Forbidden City this way, walked out in the open by a boy who was technically allowed to come and go. They were stored in the foreign quarter of a northern port city, a stockpile meant to fund the emperor's life after the inevitable end. And the fate of that private hoard was its own long tragedy. When the dynasty's last hopes collapsed and the former emperor was later installed as a puppet ruler under a foreign power, much of the hoard traveled with him. In the chaos at the end of the Second World War, as his puppet state fell apart, a portion of those smuggled masterpieces was scattered, looted again, lost, or sold off in desperation. Objects that had survived inside the palace for centuries were lost not in the great famous lootings, but in the quiet collapse of one man's private collection of stolen things. Therefore, by the time the new government acted, the collection was already wounded. In 1924, Puyi was finally expelled from the Forbidden City for good. Soldiers gave him a few hours to gather his things and leave. And then the new republic did something that changed everything. It took the palace and everything still inside it and turned it into a public museum. In 1925, the Forbidden City opened its gates as the Palace Museum. And for the first time in 5 centuries, ordinary people walked through the courtyards of the emperors. The objects that remained, the porcelain, the jade, the scrolls, the throne itself, were now the property of the nation rather than the family. What had survived the foreign armies and the inside thieves was at last counted and catalogued and put behind glass. But the treasure's journey was not over, because a new catastrophe was coming. In the 1930s, Japan invaded China, and the staff of the Young Palace Museum faced a terrible choice. If they did nothing, the greatest surviving collection of Chinese art might be bombed, burned, or carried off by another invading army. So they made an extraordinary decision. They packed the most important pieces into thousands of wooden crates and sent the treasure on the run. For more than a decade, the most precious objects of the Forbidden City traveled across China by train, by truck, by boat, and sometimes by hand, staying always ahead of the advancing front. They were hidden in temples, in caves, in remote villages. Through years of war and chaos, a collection of nearly 1 million objects was moved thousands of miles, and almost nothing was lost or broken. It remains one of the greatest feats of cultural rescue ever attempted. Think about what that journey actually demanded. Nearly 20,000 crates were packed by hand, each object wrapped and cushioned so it could survive years of rough roads. Curators who had spent their lives studying these pieces now became their guards, sleeping beside the crates in temples and caves, moving them again the moment the war drew close. Trucks broke down on mountain roads. Boats crossed rivers under threat of bombing. At one stop, a building holding the crates was struck, and yet the treasure inside survived. The men who moved the collection understood that they were carrying something that could never be replaced, and that a single fire or a single sinking boat could erase 1,000 years of art in an afternoon. They kept meticulous records, checking the crates at every stage, refusing to let the chaos of war become an excuse for loss. When the war finally ended and the crates were opened and counted, the survival rate was astonishing. A collection that had crossed a continent through the worst years of a nation's history came through very nearly whole. The treasure had been saved from the invader. What no one yet knew was that it would not be saved from the war that came next, the one that would cut it in two. And then the rescue created a permanent split. When the long war ended, China fell immediately into civil war. And as the losing side prepared to retreat, it made a final decision about the crates. the most valuable portion of the wandering treasure, thousands of the finest pieces, was loaded onto ships and carried across the strait to the island of Taiwan. The name is pronounced Tier 1. The rest of the collection remained on the mainland and eventually returned to the Forbidden City in the capital. And so the treasure of a single palace was torn permanently in two. To this day, there are two palace museums, one in the original Forbidden City on the mainland and one in Taiwan holding the pieces that crossed the sea. The same imperial collection, the same dynasty's treasure, divided by a war and a stretch of water, and claimed by two governments who each insist they are the true keeper of it. The split is not only physical, it is political. Each museum argues that it holds the legitimate heart of the collection, and the division has become one more thread in a larger and still unresolved dispute between the two governments. The treasure of the emperors, gathered to symbolize a single unbroken civilization, now stands as a symbol of that civilization divided. Visitors cross the sea to see the pieces held on the island, then cross back to see the pieces held on the mainland, and only by visiting both can anyone see what was once a single collection inside a single palace. So where did the treasure of the Forbidden City go? Strip away the legend and the answer is a map of a century of violence. A portion was looted and burned by foreign armies in 1860, scattered into the museums and homes of Europe. Another portion was carried off when 8 nations occupied the capital in 1900. A quieter portion leaked out from the inside, smuggled by servants and by the last emperor himself before the Republic ever locked the doors. What survived all of that was nationalized into a public museum, then packed into crates and marched across a country to escape a new invasion. And at the end, the survivors were split between two shores, two museums, and two rival claims that have never been resolved. The objects that remain sit behind glass now, in two cities separated by 100 miles of sea. The palace that held them is a tourist site, its 9,000 rooms walked by millions of visitors who will never know which treasures once filled them. The pieces taken by foreign soldiers surface now and then in auction houses and museum cases, their labels carefully vague about how they left China. And the rest, the portion that left no receipt, is still out there in the only place it can be. In private collections that do not advertise their origins, in the gap between what a palace once held and what two museums can now show, and in a wound that an entire nation still counts as unfinished. This is what the seized crown does. We follow the treasure after the throne falls into the palaces, the crates, the auction records, and the gaps no ledger ever closed. If you want to see how the wealth of fallen dynasties was scattered, hidden, and fought over, subscribe and stay with the investigation. Because every dynasty leaves a trail, and we are not finished tracing them.